So my talk today is on hope and despair, and what is the ethical perspective in chaotic times. And I'm going to ask Bill one more time to please mute everything that's back there, including the laptop. 2 weeks ago, in our theme this month of renewing hope, I talked about how a kind of optimism, that idea that things can be better, is really important. It's healthy and good for us as individuals, and it's also a foundation for bending the arc towards justice. Today, I want to talk about those times when we need more than just a bit of jumpstart on our hope, times of despair. Despair as a word comes from a Latin root, de, meaning without, and spare, meaning hope. So it basically means without hope. In tough times, it is easy to despair, to become cynical, and to give up hope. So how do we handle our moments or even our seasons of despair? When I planned this morning's topic, I did not know what this month would be like. A little over a month since another terrible school shooting, a terrorist attack in Norway, a Supreme Court decision, several of them, one overturning a law more than a century old in New York, and then the overturning of Roe v. Wade, with one concurring opinion adding that several other past court decisions should also be overturned. Many cultures have a tradition in times of great loss and sorrow of lamentation, a passionate expression, often with wailing and moaning and crying. In Scottish tradition, it's called keening. Some of our oldest human writings from ancient Sumer 4,000 years ago are lamentations. Lamentations appear in the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the Hindu Vedas, in the Jewish book of Job, in the Psalm, and the book of Lamentations, in Beowulf, in the stories in the Christian scriptures of Jesus, in a Mozart opera, in the poetry of Shelley. In religious context, lamentation can be an appeal to the deity for help, for relief. Often in cultures, lamentations are the job of women. One writer called lamentations the sound of trauma. Lamentations sometimes, after describing suffering, have a formula kind of progression, which includes a cursing of enemies. And I know some of us did that this week. Sometimes they also include a commitment. And they often end with a thanksgiving, recognizing what remains that is good. Social media has made it easier to do our lamentations where a lot of people can see them. More wordy than just keening and crying. But they're definitely lamentations anyway. But then some people have been responding, don't lament, don't grieve, quoting Mother Jones, the labor rebel, don't mourn, organize. Well, my response to that is we can multitask, mourn and organize. Mourning, I believe, is crucial. Letting ourselves feel that sensation of the hope draining out, that hope in the sense expressed in the Spanish word esperanza, expectation or anticipation. To be without that kind of hope is despair, desperation. Lamentations are part of how we as human beings handle dashed expectations. They are indeed the sound of trauma. Knowing that as a woman, I'm not given the same right as a corpse to consent to using my body parts, that is worth lamentation. Mere incubators under the law. And then to see those who made that decision or supported it call for an end to the rights of consenting adults to have sex, an end to any right to use contraception, an end to the right to marry without regard to the sex or gender of our partner. The same logic could be applied to the socially defined race of the partners, although that may not happen because it would personally affect certain decision makers. And there were calls this week by policymakers explicitly to restore racial segregation. Despair is an emotion to express in times when hope's expectations are dashed, when the future looks like it could be worse than the present. It's a cry of personal or social grief. Hope is the emotion that tells us that the future could be better. Not that it will be better, but that it could be. You know, the very words hope and despair, despair meaning without hope, seem like they're a binary, like they're opposites. But it's been my experience that both despair and hope help produce change. We need to see how bad things are. We need to see clearly what is going on. Avoiding the reality of how bad things are or can be could mean that we don't take the actions we need to take to avoid the worst or work for the best. And of course, we could also get stuck in despair. Some of us are more prone to that than others. And getting stuck in despair can also mean that we don't take actions that we need to take to avoid the worst and work for the best. Brene Brown talks about despair as being a sadness that accompanies hopelessness. And then she goes on to say that hopelessness usually has one of three root causes: not knowing what we want, knowing what we want but not how to get it, or knowing what we want and how to get it, but not believing that we can do it. And getting stuck in hopelessness can lead to a cynicism that is, as Rebecca Solnit wrote, the privilege of the comfortable. She continued, if everything is doomed, then nothing is required of us. I had my own moments of despair in January when my husband Bill and I were both sick with at first undiagnosed COVID. The symptoms that we had were not what we expected, not understanding that with the new variant, the symptoms had also shifted. I just knew I was sick enough not to have physical or mental energy, and Bill was really sick. He was just not himself, not at all. He resisted getting any help. I became convinced that he was dying, and I thought I was going to lose him. And I had no idea how to help. Speaking out my despair into the world turned out to be the best thing that I could do. Because, among others, my son heard my desperation. He reached out to offer help, and he delivered it. He called Bill's son, who got Bill to the hospital, where Bill recovered for 3 weeks, followed by 4 weeks in rehab, and then 6 weeks of professional at-home visits by healthcare people. He's still recovering, but he is significantly back to himself. That concrete help was crucial. But even beyond the concrete help, so was just the fact that our sons and a daughter-in-law in person were there. Keening, crying out in despair, may be a way that we help each other know when we are in need. We need to not be alone in times of despair. When we cry out in despair, we are grasping for hope. Some hope that there is a way back out of those depths. The ancient format of the lamentation, which includes a cry for a deity, I often think that this is really how it works. By crying out loud for help, we also trigger other human beings to provide that help. My theistic friends would say God sends people to do God's work. My humanist friends would say, by articulating that we are suffering and that we need help, others know that they are needed. Well, and it's hard for someone like me, whose job it usually is to be the person you reach out to be the one to reach out. Facing the despair and letting ourselves cry out our pain, it is a part of being human. And I believe it is the first step back from the whirlpool of despair. Another time in my life, I was at a conference away from home. I woke up one morning crying, and at first I wasn't sure why. And I finally realized that morning was the 30th anniversary of my mother's death. I found myself weeping as if she had died that morning. Well, I knew that I had to eat, so I made my way to the dining hall, but I was still sobbing. Two friends knew what to do. The two of them separately, but at the same time, came to me and stood next to me, not asking a single question, not saying a single word, just each of them putting a hand on one of my shoulders until I was calm enough to gather myself together, tell them what was going on, and then I could move on into the day. The sadness was still there, but not that sense of despair. Henry J.M. Newen, the author of Wounded Healer, one of my favorite books, wrote, "The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares." And really, so often that's all the support we really need. Well, then there was a time of lamentation when I was much younger. Over Thanksgiving weekend, a dear friend had died by suicide. And to make it worse, this friend had been sinking into a paranoia for months, and none of his friends had noticed. He left a journal about being targeted by the government. And in this journal, he wrote about how all of his friends were collaborating and spying on him for the government. It all felt like such a devastating loss. So I went to my community of the time that Sunday. The program was a concert of John Denver music. And there I was, sobbing, needing to just be in community, while the group in the front, the musical group, was bouncily singing "Country Roads Take Me Home" and "Thank God I'm a Country Boy" and "Rocky Mountain High." Once in a while, the musicians would look my way, obviously confused by why I was sobbing through the whole concert. Something like our joys and concerns in that community came late in their program. And I was finally able to share in words that I had lost a friend to suicide. I'll never forget the look of relief on the musicians' faces when they realized that they had nothing to do with why I was sobbing. And I found relief being able to share my grief with the community. But let's face it, it's been really hard to do this kind of community support for the last 2+ years with our physical separation and isolation. That lack of presence for so long may make it harder for us to deal with the social grief as well that is part of our current political climate. Despair and hope, I believe, are phases, not opposites. Facing our despair, facing the reality that we have lost something, and that it will be hard to get to normal again, if we ever can. That is the first step. Crying it out, touching the world, touching community, is the second step towards dealing with a very real pain. Lamentation can help us do that as the sound of trauma. Trauma, that emotional shock at a deeply disturbing event, physical or emotional. But what then is next? How do we move from despair to being able to face life again and use our hope to motivate us? I don't think we do as well without facing this new reality of loss and getting connected. But then what is next? Some people can muster a faith that things can go well. Some can find comfort and soothing in words like those of that mystic, Julian of Norwich. All will be well. All manner of things will be well. Not that they are already well, not denying that all is not well right now. and not ignoring that we will have to do our part, but all will be well. We can also look for what is already well, even when we are despairing because some hopes are under threat. Mantras of hope can help some of us sometimes pull ourselves out of the whirlpool. For me, the mantra that works comes from Frodo, that character in Lord of the Rings. It's a simple one. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given us. And there are other ways to deal with it. The author Barbara Kingsolver, in describing her own journey from despair, gave her recipe. She wrote, "In my own worst seasons, I've come back from the colorless world of despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing, a flame of red geranium outside my bedroom window. And then another, my daughter in a yellow dress. And another, the perfect outline of a full dark sphere behind the crescent moon, until I learned to be in love with my life again." You know, getting out of self and touching the wider world. We also, as social beings, have each other and this world that we live in. I mentioned my short mantra from Frodo earlier. Here is a longer version that I sometimes read to myself or others. This is at a moment in the story when Frodo is losing hope and is in the depths of despair. And Sam, his buddy, remembers the great stories about people who kept going. Sam says, "Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Folk in those old stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something." And Frodo says, "What are we holding on to, Sam?" And Sam says, "That there is some good in the world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." I do believe we are in big trouble in this country and in the world. There is supposed to be another Supreme Court decision coming out in the next week or so, I hear, which will make it more difficult to take measures to cut back on the use of fossil fuels. Those of us who can connect the dots on climate change, who have taken in the overwhelming evidence that we have to act now or it gets more and more likely that life will get much more difficult, especially for the most vulnerable, we will grieve and lament when we hear that news too. And facing that reality, again, is step one of dealing with any danger, threat, or loss. Only if we face that it's that bad can we begin to deal with it at all. And only if we assume that it is possible to make a difference will we do so. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we do nothing, things will most likely continue to get worse. If we do something, things might get better. I'm going to quote Cornel West here because I think he says this better than I can. "The country is in deep trouble. We have forgotten that a rich life consists fundamentally of serving others, trying to leave the world a little better than you found it. We need the courage to question the powers that be, the courage to be impatient with evil and patient with people, the courage to fight for social justice. In many instances," he continues, "we will be stepping out on nothing and just hoping to land on something. But that is the struggle. To live is to wrestle with despair, yet never allow despair to have the last word." And bell hooks. "Hope is essential to every political struggle for radical change when the overall social climate promotes disillusionment and despair." So I hope in the social time today, you will share with each other some of your own experiences of dealing with finding hope even when there's danger, threat, or loss. We're going to need each other. There is a reason that a traditional lamentation ended with a thanksgiving. Recognition of what is still good is part of how we avoid sticking in despair. Human goodness is not erased by the bad acts that people also do, or the challenges we face. Plant seeds of human kindness and love, and open your eyes and ears and hearts to the kindness and love that is around us. The beauty, the pockets of stability, we need those too to remind us of the world that we want to create, expand, and sustain. We can love life even while we acknowledge pain, mourn and organize. There's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. So for those of you who are watching on video later, you can find more about us at rysec.org, rysec.org.